US is bringing in more and more military hardware near Iran. So this video will explore what sort of risk is there for the US forces if they do attack Iran. We will look into US assets during the strikes, but also US bases in the Middle East, which are plentiful and exposed. We will analyze missile defenses and possible Iranian missile capabilities, as well as try to estimate just what sort of risk and damage could Iranian retaliation do to US forces. So stay tuned. The US has a fairly big military force near Iran now, potent enough to do some serious damage and even upkeep airstrikes for weeks if needed. This video won't really speculate on the scope of the possible US attack or the type of targets it might go after. But if, for example, Iranian leadership or strategic targets are continuously attacked by the US, it's pretty plausible Iran would attempt some kind of retaliatory measure like it did in 2025 against Israel. In all likelihood, such a response would be made up of missile and drone attacks. While a ground attack on US base in Kuwait is theoretically possible, it might be seen as a further escalation of the war. Plus, the distance to US bases there is still such that the majority of Iranian ground force attack would likely be destroyed from the air. Land action-wise, there are greater threats by smaller saboteur groups acting on various small US outposts and bases in Iraq and Syria. Navy-wise, Iran is quite anemic, and whatever it would try to send over the Gulf, crossing 100 or 200 kilometers, would get detected and killed quickly. The biggest threat on the seas would really come in a form of attempted strait closure for various cargo ship due to attempted missile attacks and minefields deployed near the Strait of Hormuz. That might easily lead to the sinking of several to even dozen cargo ships. But again, it could be construed as further escalation of the conflict. There are also Houthist forces in Yemen which could attack further cargo ships like they did 2 years ago, or could even try to go after some military ships. But all those are fairly minor factors. By far the most expected source of Iranian firepower are missile attacks. Not really aircraft bomb runs, as Iran's air force was quite dilapidated even before Israel attacked it further in June 2025. So we are really talking about missile and drone attacks. That said, Iranian missile forces aren't what they used to be. During the June 2025 war, Israel largely enjoyed air superiority over Iran, looking for all sorts of targets and engaging many missile launchers and SAM launchers in addition to fixed targets such as missile depots, stockpiles, and various missile-producing facilities. Approximately 43 to 50 Iranian ballistic missiles are estimated to have hit Israel, inflicting a certain level of structural damage and some civilian casualties. In 2020, U.S. General McKenzie estimated Iran had up to 3,000 ballistic missiles of various ranges, most of which could not reach Israel. Iran's missile production was quickly increasing back then, but according to Israeli intelligence, it had not reached 1,000 missiles per year. So it's plausible hundreds were being added per year by 2024. Back then, Iran spent some 320 or more long-range missiles on Israel in 2 short barges. During the June 2025 war, Iran launched at least 550 more long-range missiles into Israel. But Israel was also hitting Iranian missile facilities, stockpiles, and launchers, a fair number of which likely had missiles on them. By the end of the war, Israel claimed destruction of over 200 ballistic missile launchers, which they said constituted 40% of Iranian launchers overall. And in another instance, Israel said 2-3 of Iranian ballistic missile launchers were hit, though possibly not destroyed. Now, it's been over half a year since, and it's quite probable many new launchers have been made. A launcher on a commercial truck is not exactly an exotic product, and Iran may have easily made dozens and dozens more since. Ballistic missiles, especially large ones, are more complex, and their production usually takes longer. With the fairly extensive damage done to Iranian missile-producing facilities, it's plausible Iran wasn't really able to add hundreds of new long-range missiles since the June war. The exact number in Iranian inventory is unknown, of course. Israeli intelligence was at times quoted by Israeli media saying Iran in 2026 had some 2,000 ballistic missiles left. Some have even interpreted that to mean 2,000 long-range missiles able to reach Israel. But that's most likely erroneous, though a total inventory of at least 2,000 missiles, with the majority being shorter-range missiles, is quite plausible. And that's where the danger for the U.S. forces lies. not in large missiles, which require large truck launchers, which are themselves easier to track and possibly attack before they fire their loads, but from smaller launchers, which can more easily come out of cover, launch their loads, and then disappear. Unlike Israel, which is like 1,000 kilometers away from Iran, U.S. bases are much, much closer, ranging anywhere from 130 km for Kuwait, 200 to 300 km for most of the Gulf bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and UAE, to 600 km for the U.S. forces near Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Though, of course, the U.S. has forces all over the Middle East, including Syria, Israel, Jordan, and so on. All in all, the U.S. has dozens of various large facilities and bases all over the Middle East with approximately 45,000 U.S. troops in those bases. So, there is a lot of risk involved. As said, Iran likely has well over a 000, possibly 1,500 short-reach ballistic missiles with which it could strike U.S. bases. All those can't be launched at once, of course, but it's plausible there could be multiple dozens if not 100 launchers available for simultaneous launches. Usually, such smaller missiles have more reloads ready per launcher. As it's risky to get the launchers to the edge of Iranian borders, as then they might get more easily detected, Iran would still rely quite a lot on medium-range systems. Now, no one can really know what sort of damage can Iran inflict. On one hand, it's not likely Iran would dare to launch preemptively. That would just cause the U.S. to grow even bolder. On the other hand, launching reactively means U.S. planes are already continuously overflying Iran, especially southwestern Iran, from which most missile launches might originate. The U.S. has quite a few assets in place already, and that's not counting possible aid from the Israeli Air Force, which has already shown it could do much of the work on its own back in 2025. In a sense, the toughest part has already been done: dismantling of Iranian air defense network. Israel said it had 7 SAM batteries in 2024, destroying most Iranian S-300 SAMs. In 2025, it said it destroyed 17 SAM batteries and several dozen early warning radars. That basically means most of Iranian SAM network has been obliterated. Remember, those are batteries, not SAM launchers, as Israel said that it hit 120 SAM launchers 4 days into the war. In addition to 300 Israeli warplanes that may or may not be part of the action, and assuming Saudi Arabia and other countries keep using their air forces just for defensive ops like hunting down Iranian cruise missiles and large drones. The U.S. still has approximately 120 tactical combat aircraft in the area, most of them in Jordan and several dozen on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln. That's in the Indian Ocean, fairly close to Iran. But that's only the known force. It's quite plausible that the U.S. could bring in more planes quickly, just mere days before an operation begins. In the U.K. alone, the U.S. has 90 more jets like F-15E and F-35A, which it could bring in closer. The U.K. has also sent a token number of Eurofighters to Qatar, but could send more planes to its base on Cyprus if needed. All those figures still don't account for bombers which could come in from any direction. One of the more logical places would be Diego Garcia Base in the Indian Ocean, but even transcontinental flights from the U.S. directly could be expected. Those are just the more attack-oriented forces, planes that could fly over Iran and hunt for ballistic missile launchers. When it comes to forces defending the Gulf area, those are even more plentiful. Not all would be involved for sure, but it's to be expected that any country where a U.S. base is present would keep its planes in the air patrolling for Iranian cruise missiles and drones. In Israel, almost all such weapons were intercepted by aircraft and air defenses. So, it's not likely Iran would have a lot of success using those slow-moving flyers. The U.S. has, for example, added cheap and plentiful guided rocket pods to its F-15 in the Middle East, which are there to help against saturation attacks with drones. But by far, the most heavy lifting would be done by SAM systems trying to engage various ballistic missiles. Fighter jets can't engage those. Luckily for the U.S., the number and coverage of such systems is massive in the Middle East. Exact deployment is always in flux, but approximately a year ago, the U.S. Army had something like 15 Patriot SAM batteries deployed all over the Middle East, as well as 1 THAAD battery. Since then, We know that the US had deployed 2 more THAADs in Israel, and that in the last few weeks, it has been bringing in an unknown number of additional Patriot batteries to the area. Back in 2025, there was a report that 73 C-7 cargo flights were needed to move a battalion, meaning 4 batteries worth of Patriots. Now, in January, plane trackers spotted at least 41 C-7 flights and 1 C-5 flight into the Middle East. That's far from being conclusive, though, as many other equipment could have been brought in. But it's plausible that at least an additional battery or 2 of Patriots has been moved. As the U.S. military has approximately 60 Patriot batteries in total active service, it means a quarter of those may now be in the Middle East. And 3 out of 8 THAAD batteries in service may still remain deployed, probably most of them in Israel. THAAD is designed against longer-range ballistic missiles, so it doesn't make sense to deploy it just across the Gulf. While the Patriots use MSC missiles, which have been quite improved since the early PAC-3 models. In fact, it was confirmed back in 2023 that Ukraine had gotten both the earlier PAC-3 and latest MSSE missiles. So, it's not surprising that Ukraine later achieved fairly decentish intercept ratios against Russian ballistic missiles like Kenzel. In 2024, it reported that up to that point, Russia launched 111 Kal missiles, sort of like air-launched Iskanders, and that 25% were intercepted. Though somewhat damningly, Russia had also fired 1,300 Iskander and ballistic missiles, of which only 4.5% were intercepted. That can, however, be explained by the fact most targets in Ukraine were not being covered by Patriots. Ukraine had just 4 or so Patriot batteries by mid-2024. In the Middle East, US would have a much better coverage with literally all the bases protected by at least a pair of Patriots with possibly some additional overlap. And that's counting just the US Patriots. Most of the Gulf countries also operate Patriots of their own, with Saudi Arabia alone having massive 13 batteries in action. That's an additional 35 batteries. And Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world which bought US THAAD as well, with at least 1 battery operational by now. All this does not count in Israeli air defenses, which would granted stay in Israel. But maybe they would aid protecting the US base in Jordan. So the coverage is massively better than in Ukraine, with individual bases having their own Patriots. And Iranian medium-range missiles are on the average not nearly as good as Russian Iskanders. Unlike Iskanders, they usually lack terminal maneuvering decoys, and their precision may still be a bit behind. That said, a warhead of half a ton or more, typical for SUK,